Python functions can have default arguments. Arguments that have default values so they can be ignored when the function is called in case these default values are to be used. The value of a default argument is defined by using the assignment or equal sign in both def or lambda functions. For example, so here we define b as a default argument because we said b equals to 0, so its default value is 0. Now let's try this function. Let's say print f7. So as you see, although we didn't give a value to the second argument, because it is default, the function worked with one argument. If we add another argument, it works with the new argument and ignores the default value. If we define both arguments as default, the function can work without arguments because both are default. Lambda function also can take default arguments. For example, so it works. We can make both of them have default arguments. So we can run the code. Now there's an important rule when using the default arguments. With non-default arguments, when we are mixing the two types of arguments, default arguments should be the last arguments in the sequence. So for that reason, as you see at the top, when I define the def function or the lambda function, I put the definitions of the first arguments between brackets because they could be optional. That means they could be default or non-default. But if I'm going to use default arguments, there should be in the end of the list, like argument I and argument j. Now in example 1, this is just a look to print function. So when we type print, we have some arguments actually in print, and 4 of these arguments are default. The first argument sep adds separators between the printed values if there are multiple values. End controls the end of the line, so the default is to go to new line. File is not defined, none here, because it works with data files when they are using data file streams. And flush is used when it works with the memory. Let's test, for example, the SEP. So as you see, this is the separator. This added the ampersand or the and symbol between the numbers. And the default is space. So if I take this out, example 2, the archive receives numbers as a list because it works with the function sum. It receives file name as a string. It has factor, which is a float. Extension is a string, which defines file extension here. And printing is a Boolean variable. That means it's true or false. First, in order to use the Python shell, let's run the code. So let's try something like and as you see, it worked. It gave the sum of the list, it multiplied factor 1, and then it concatenated the extension of file to my file and printed because printing is true. I can change the factor and I can change the extension. That's it. Again, it worked. What if I don't want to print anything? So instead of printing, I said false here. What happened? Now I entered false and I'm expecting that it will print no print, but instead it used factor 0 and took the default extension with, of course, the numbers. The result is here because when I entered false in the location of the factor, we know that false has an integer equivalent, which is 0. So it took false as a value of the factor 0. It didn't take it as the argument or the value of printing. So for that reason, if I'm going to use false as a value for printing, I need to call it by name. This way. Although it is not in the position, because printing in the last is the last argument in the list, but once I called it by name, it works normally. Similarly, I can use this with extension dot xls. Now enroute is a lambda function, so it takes 2 arguments. Let's say enroute. Now this function returns the nth root. That means the square root, the cubic root, and so on. If I say print enroute 9 be 3, because the default value of n is 2, so it will give us the square root. But if we define the, for example, let's say 27,3, so in this way it took the cubic root. There is an interesting property for arguments, for default arguments or arguments in general, that function arguments can be passed in any order if all defined by name when called. For example, let us use this function. I entered all arguments defined by name. They are not exactly in the same order of the archive as you see at the top. Let's see what happens. And it worked. Because we have printing false, let's try to make printing true in order to see the so as you see, it works.